So Semperis has recently published a survey conducted amongst end users who downloaded your free Purple Knight security assessment tool. And in this survey, I know you do a lot of security things, but this one focused on Microsoft's Active Directory. So without giving away too many secrets, because I think we're going to discuss those in more detail, were you surprised, pleased? What were your sort of reaction to the results of the survey?
Right. So thank you. I have to say we were not very surprised, or at least I wasn't. One of the reasons why we came out with this tool initially is because we understood that the community at large and companies have it's a big challenge to secure Active Directory, right? So I don't think it surprised us that much that a lot of organizations, especially the larger organizations with older installations of Active Directory, have a lot of issues when it comes to securing that infrastructure. So we weren't very surprised. I think, and I can only speak for myself here, I was expecting around 70-75%, and it did come out a bit lower than that. But I think generally this is what we thought would happen.
Yeah, I think maybe just to expand on that one, it's interesting because about 3 weeks ago, I want to say, we have celebrated the 1 year since the release of Purple Knight. And during that relatively short period of time, we already had more than 5,000 organizations worldwide that have used the tool, which is, from my perspective, it shows that companies are becoming more and more aware of the concerns about AD security. Now, if you think about it, AD has been around for more than 20 years. It has been deployed in an age where security was definitely not top of mind. It was kind of the afterthought in a good case scenario. So from our perspective, it's not really surprising to see that a lot of the things that we used as assumptions in the early deployments of AD no longer hold from the security perspective and requires a revisit of the situation as it applies to the current days.
Okay, and you say the overall score, I think, was 68% across 5 Active Directory security categories. And Ran, you hinted that you weren't perhaps surprised that large organizations were slightly lower scoring than higher. But from my perspective, one always thinks that larger companies have more personnel, more knowledge, and therefore, but it's just, as you say, it's because they're so large and complex that there are going to be more little sort of dark corners where they don't actually know what's going on. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Think about it this way: a large organization with thousands of employees, with tens of thousands of devices, with servers, deploying applications, managing those applications, just the daily administration of Active Directory, of all of this system, and the complexity in operating this infrastructure is such that over time you're just going to collect a lot of leftovers, right? And even the most sanitary organizations with the best policies in place to make sure you clean up and so on, there's always going to be something left behind, and AD is such that it's just very, very difficult to really clean everything up. So over time, you just get a lot of stuff that piles up, and these are the things that attacker abuse to get in and do what they want. So I don't think we weren't really surprised that larger organizations had these kind of dark hidden corners in their Active Directory.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Phil, we definitely see in large organizations very well trained and educated AD people that fully understand what they're doing and so on. So it's not the lack of knowledge. It's just, as Ran mentioned, the amount of changes that are happening in a large environment, we see in some of the cases more than tens of thousands of changes on a daily basis. So it's just impossible to keep track with everything. And if you think about what is today known in the industry as the configuration drift, right? Basically, you got to a point where you are happy with where you are, but then things happen. And over time, your environment is changing. And that's basically what creates those holes that the attacker can potentially take advantage of. The other thing is that it's also very hard to keep up with all of the new releases that are coming out all the time in terms of the things that are being found in the market. So even if I got to a point where I have secured my environment and I'm good in a certain point of time, there is always some new research coming out, and the attackers are finding ways to go in different ways. And so the challenge there from our perspective is that the bigger the organization, the more holes potentially exist in the environment. Not because they're not doing a great job, they are. It's just because of the fact that there's just so much more in terms of the attack surface that is available for the attacker.
Okay, fair enough. And in terms of the 5 categories, perhaps you could just tell us what they were. And I believe that it was account security of those 5 that had the lowest scores. And if there are any particular reasons you uncovered for that, please share those.
Yeah, so when the categories that we look at are AD delegation, how the various permissions are delegated across the infrastructure. Then we look at account security, which I'll talk about more in a bit. We look at the infrastructure security, right? How the infrastructure itself is set up in terms of the configurations and the patch management and so on. We look at group policy security, and we look at Kerberos security, which is the actual authentication mechanism. And of those, as you mentioned, account security scored the lowest. And the reason for that is, as Mickey and I said, account security is where we look at did you really close all the accounts? How are you managing passwords? Are there permission drift? Is there leftover groups that remained over time and weren't cleaned up? Are there groups that are nested within other groups? And just a bunch of these kind of low-lying configurations and setups that just get left over as time progresses.
Okay, and in terms of the, did you discover sort of different industries, whether some were better or worse than others? And I mean, is that significant? Do you think that certain industries are better with Active Directory security, or do you think it's perhaps more of a coincidence, or do you think there are actually industries, I say, that are leading in the way and others that perhaps need to catch up?
So the lowest scores that we saw were for insurance companies, and then healthcare and transportation, while the highest scores were on public infrastructure companies and government entities. And it makes sense that the reason for that is that insurance companies and similar types of companies have had a lot of M&As in their past. So they may have merged several domains together. And it's common when you merge with a company on the IT side, often you'll merge their domain into your domain, and they usually will go through some process of hardening the environment and making sure that it's secure. But as with all things AD, a lot of things from the past will slip through, and you'll just over the years you'll accumulate this kind of security debt. And these things will often remain hidden for years, which is what we're seeing. While on the other end of the spectrum, the more regulated environments that include, public infrastructure and government agencies, they will usually have more processes in place to review all the settings, and they'll have more tools in place to scan Active Directory and to make sure that that everything is accounted for. And I think that kind of explains the difference that we're seeing across industries.
It's actually an interesting point that Ran is bringing up here, because what I've been seeing across both our customers and partners is the usage of Purple Knight prior they merge with the company that have been acquired. So basically, before we go in and we introduce a potential risk from the environment of the acquired company, they will basically use Purple Knight to figure out what is it that will be opening up towards our environment. And if the risk score there is high, then they will work with the company ahead of time. Let's first close the gaps and only then introduce them into our environment, so that we will not be putting the main company at risk.
Okay, and in terms, I think, Ran, you've alluded to it in your answer just now, but I think you sort of followed up your initial research with a few more questions, and you found that, I think, misconfigurations proliferate amongst companies that have legacy Active Directory implementations. I'm just interested, I suppose, what you would define as legacy. How many years is that, and is this entirely because, as you say, M&As happen so over a long period of time, people are acquired, and there's just a bit of a mess, if you like, of implementations, or are there other just the reasons behind that highlighting the misconfigurations?
I'll actually give you some my 2 cents on this one, because I've been involved with AD deployments for quite a while now, pretty much since the beginning, I would say. And one of the things that is interesting to mention is that what used to be best practices recommendations at the early days of Active Directory turned out to be completely wrong, or basically completely different from what you would be recommending today. At the early days when AD was just introduced, there was this assumption that domain is a security boundary. Several years after on, it was clearly that this is not the case. Domain can by no means can be a security boundary. So if you have made a deployment that had that as an assumption, you will need to deal with this new situation where it's just wrong. Another part of it that was also kind of the early days recommendations, I at some point worked for an organization that had multiple domains that were distributed across the world. And that was created because, again, the assumption of the domain being the security boundary. But in the fast forward to where we are today, the general recommendation is to have as minimum number as domains as you can. Definitely don't treat domains as a security boundary. If anything, then the forest is the security boundary. And there are plenty of other recommendations of the same sort. This is just a very significant one, so it's easy to explain. But my point is that if you go back to organizations that kind of adopted AD at the early days as AD was coming out, and I would say there is a very big chunk of those. So anyone who adopted AD, I would say before 2003 to 2006, give or take, was working under the assumption that basically the best practices that were provided from the security perspective turned out to be not exactly correct if you're looking at what those are now. So if you are a company that have deployed AD in the what I would refer to as the early days, which is a big chunk of the companies out there, then you will fit the definition of what we call legacy. And that will, in most cases, will mean that you are going to have some challenges with the security definitions in your environment.
Yeah, I'd just add to that there's not really a strict definition of legacy, and often, especially with security, it's going to be more about, or often it'll be more about legacy processes, right? So while you might have an organizational process for change management and security that's pretty robust today, maybe you just implemented that 2 years ago. So while 5 years ago, your technology may have been up to date, if your processes weren't up to date and you weren't doing change management appropriately and you weren't doing hardening appropriately, then you probably have some legacy issues. Right, so the technology may be up to date, but you still have those lingering artifacts in AD that are opportunities for attackers.
Just as a supplementary to that, and I'm not trying to hammer Microsoft in particular, but where do you think the responsibility for you say obviously what was received wisdom in the early days was almost like completely about face a few years later? Do you think Microsoft perhaps could have done more to explain to people that they'd changed their mind or the world had changed, or is it end users' responsibility to keep up to date with all the latest in security, and therefore they should have been smarter?
So I think from my perspective, Microsoft definitely upped their game, and they've been upping their game since 2003. But also, to be fair, we need to keep in mind that the environment in which we operate today is very, very different from what it was 20 years ago. I mean, 20 years ago, if you think about, virtualization was not yet a thing. Cloud was not even a word unless you were referring to something in the sky. The remote work was kind of not really there yet. Mobile devices, I mean, smartphone did not exist yet, and so on and so forth. So it would be kind of unfair to come and say, oh, you haven't thought about it back in the day, because yes, nobody thought about it back in the day. With that said, I do think that Microsoft have been improving a lot over the years, and they constantly introduce new abilities to help organizations. But with that said, the general approach that Microsoft have is also making sure that they have a very robust partners community, different ISVs and so on, that go in and help with closing some of the gaps as well. So kind of to summarize that point, I think it's not really fair to say that this is Microsoft responsibility, because again, 20 years ago, nobody would have thought about how the world is going to look today.
Yeah, and I mean, Active Directory is an amazing infrastructure, right? There's a reason why, 20 plus years later, we're still using it, and there's no real alternative to it. It works, and it can do practically anything you need it to do, right? And in the trade-offs that make up security, for this type of versatile infrastructure, you're going to have security gaps if you're not managing appropriately and doing what needs to be done. We can't. Microsoft has, as Mickey said, Microsoft has made industry-changing advancements in security. I think they've taught us all a lot about security, but just for the type of infrastructure we're talking about, it's impossible to secure everybody, right? With this type of versatile infrastructure, and that's why we have the ecosystem, and that's why we have services and so on that customize the security needs for every type of Active Directory user.
Yeah, and just to add to that, what I always remind people is that Active Directory is not a solution that cannot secure your organization. As Ran just stated, I strongly believe that AD can meet the requirements of most of the things that companies still need today. It just requires a different configuration, and it requires some sort of a third tools that should be deployed with the solution to make sure that it is secured, properly configured, properly managed, and so on and so forth. But that's the same statement as I would have for any other solution that you use.
Okay, and perhaps part of the issue as well is, I know your follow-up research also found, I think, that overall there was a lack of Active Directory expertise in organizations. So maybe, to that point you've just made, there aren't enough people, up to speed with what they need to be. Is that right?
It is from my point of view. There's definitely a lack of knowledge, and the people that did have the knowledge is starting to be harder and harder to find those. The fact that the AD has been around for so long, and then also since it's kind of considered to be the on-prem environment, and in this new cool environment is now cool to be cloud. So AD kind of did not have enough people that will continue and learn how to properly use and secure AD. But then you hit the reality where 90% of the companies out there are using the Active Directory as their main tool, as the main directory repository. So you have this interesting gap where on one hand, it's not cool, it's not sexy. On the other hand, it's being used by everybody out there. And the thing that even more importantly, it's definitely being used by the attackers when they go after the organizations, because they know that once they get a hold of AD, they can do whatever they want. So there is definitely a gap there that we are trying to figure out how to close it and what can potentially be done.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the cool kids might not be learning how to set up Active Directory, but they're definitely learning how to attack Active Directory, right? So we need to develop the tools to enable defenders to catch up to that, right, and secure that environment.
Okay, and to that point, I mean, you've obviously carried out this research, I guess, with a sort of objective in mind, and I'm assuming that's partly that you as an organization are able to help folks address, any gaps in their Active Directory security. Is that right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, in terms of, I mean, do you have a sort of specific product solutions, or is it more a consultative basis? Someone will say, we've got these issues, or they've uncovered those issues, and now can you help us with that?
No, for sure. So we actually did the research, not exactly for the purpose that you just alluded to. We made the research because we really wanted to understand what is the current state of events, so we kind of know what should we be focusing more and so forth. But in terms of where we can help customers, Semperis provide the entire attack kill chain coverage for the Active Directory. Basically, we're helping companies, and this is a product-based solution. So our platform allows customers to have the pre-attack view of basically helping customers to close the gaps as much as possible and reduce the attack surface that can be used by an attacker that is going after their environments. And then we also help customers during the attack stage, where we're basically focused on detecting as fast as possible and making sure that we have the highest data integrity in terms of our ability to understand what the attacker is doing in the environment, contain it as fast as possible, whatever that might mean, because it's different for every type of an attack that we're seeing out there. And then basically helping customers in the worst case scenario, where they have either completely lost control over the environment because the attacker is already have a privileged account and controls the environment, and not it's not longer being controlled by the organization. Or if you think about the ransomware, the wiper type of situations, the NotPetya, Locker-Goga, and so on, then if your entire environment has been destroyed, then the orchestration of AD recovery is a very complex one, and it's something that needs to happen before everything else can be restored. So we can definitely help there as well. In terms of what we actually offer, it's a combination of, I would say, product and people, more heavily towards the product side of things. But we also have an incident response team that allows our customers to tap into the, as we just mentioned, the relatively scarce knowledge of AD and AD security when it comes to dealing with the worst day that they're having.
And in terms of, I mean, for most end users, will they be acutely aware that they have, deficiencies around Active Directory, or with your Purple Knight, the free security assessment tool, is that a great place to start? So whether you know or not, if you run this, then you will find out. And I didn't ask actually at the survey, were most people surprised at how many gaps they found? They all thought, well, we're doing quite a good job, and then the surveys were, and they were, oh, okay, right, we've got an issue. I guess that what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is the assessment tool is a pretty important thing to use to start with. Then you actually know where you are before you started, redressing the situation. Yeah.
100% correct. The assessment is what will allow you to understand where you are. I think what's one of the things that is very unique about Purple Knight is that we took with the Purple Knight security assessment tool the same approach as the attacker will take. So there is nothing to install. There is no need for any privileged permissions in the environment. You basically run a bunch of queries, let's put it this way, against your AD, just as I would do if I were trying to break your environment. But now the organization can actually have a look of how the attacker is looking in their environment, which will allow them to figure out where they are and hopefully to do something about it.
And I want to add, when we launched Purple Knight a year and a month ago, we had a web conference, and we started the web conference with a survey asking the participants how secure they feel their Active Directory is. And I think about 70% answered that it was fairly secure. And after we finished the webinar, we asked the question again, and the results were much lower. So I think, yeah, I think there is initially, I think CISOs, until several years ago, until the latest ransomware attacks of the past 2-3 years, they had this notion that Active Directory is this kind of system. They don't know much about it. They know they're managing users and computers, but as long as there's a policy in place to lock the old users, then everything is fine, right? And over the past several years, we've been seeing this understanding that this is an iceberg, right? There's so much underneath the surface that if you don't know about, attackers are able, with a simple entry point, to find an attack path that could just lead them to full admin and all the keys of the kingdom, right? And that awareness is definitely growing, and we're seeing that. And Purple Knight, as Mickey said, is our attempt to take only some of the knowledge and proficiency we have within our commercial products and give it to the community as kind of a look. This is where you are. Use this to at least increase your posture somewhat. You still need to do the monitoring and the workflow management and address after the attack scenarios and things like that, but at least take this to help you get started.
Okay. And do you have any plans to carry out the survey again, in another year's time or whatever it is, to actively, to discover whether things are getting better, or hopefully getting better and not, at least not any worse, or was it a one-off exercise?
Yeah, definitely are.
Okay, and maybe just sort of to conclude, in terms of end users who are aware, we've talked about the sort of Purple Knight running the assessment tool, but once that flags up some gaps, are there one or two sort of pieces of advice you'd give them, general advice as to what to be, short of panicking and wondering whether, so constructive advice, is there a sort of method, a road to improving that situation.
So
yeah.
panicking is definitely not the way to go. And the number one advice is don't panic. But I think maybe something to clarify about Purple Knight. In addition to the assessment that Purple Knight provides, it also provides you with initial recommendations for the things that have been found in the environment, suggesting what are the potential steps that you can take in order to mitigate the gaps that you are seeing. The other thing that I would mention is that we are also providing for most of our customers, and just for companies out there, not necessarily our customers, the ability to tap in either into our knowledge, either into the knowledge of our partners. They can basically go with you over the report, and we've seen multiple of those where a company will run the report, they will get a score, and it will basically will say, well, we are not 100% clear that we understand what is it that we can do in order to improve it. In such cases, we are happy to either have somebody from our security team have a chat with them to give them initial explanation of how to go about the things that they found, or to connect them to one of the partners that can also go in and help them to figure out what are the things that can be done, how to prioritize those, and so on.
And we also have a community that we're building around Purple Knight. So we have a Slack channel where people ask questions about the results that they're getting and what it means. And there's been some great conversations. We've also improved our indicators and some features we had based on community feedback. So Purple Knight is definitely a continuous work in progress. There's a great community, and it's great to see people helping each other out. They don't know each other. They get on Slack. Even when they have bugs with the program, right, with the application, they weren't able to run it. Another user from the community actually solved the bug for them without even us getting involved. So that's really something that's great to see, and it's good to see the community get together around something like this.
Okay, well, it's been lovely to chat to you both. So Ran and Mickey, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.